Ever wonder about those massive economic shifts happening, on the global stage, especially between continents like Europe and Africa that have, well, such a complicated history?
Absolutely. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah, so today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the evolving strategic relationship between the European Union and Africa, and we're really zeroing in on trade and investment.
Right. And our mission here really
Hmm.
is to help you quickly get the key insights. We're looking at the EU's new strategy, digging out some surprising facts, and, the underlying dynamics shaping this really powerful partnership.
And it's not just about the EU's plans on paper. It's also about, well, what's really driving it and how does it actually work out in practice? Because there seems to be this deliberate push moving away from that old donor recipient way of thinking,
Exactly. It's framed as mutual cooperation, common interests, shared benefits.
which sounds good, but
Well, this whole deep dive, it's grounded in these recent proposals for a comprehensive EU strategy with Africa. And it really underlines Africa's growing strategic importance, globally speaking. It's not just talk, it's a recognition of Africa's rise.
okay, let's unpack this then. To really get a handle on the ambition here and maybe some of the contradictions too, we need to look at the vision the EU's laid out.
Right.
So, at the heart of it is this European Commission document, a joint communication from back in March 2020. This lays out proposals for the strategy. And the big idea seems to be building an alliance with Africa, not for Africa. So, what are the sort of main pillars?
Okay, so the strategy outlines 5 key partnerships. First up is the green transition and energy access.
Okay.
The idea here is maximizing Africa's huge potential for green growth,
Yeah.
but also minimizing environmental threats. And importantly, doing it all in line with the Paris Agreement.
That definitely sounds like a long term vision. What about something maybe a bit more immediate, like technology?
Good question. That brings us straight to number 2. Digital transformation. Here, the goal is pretty clear. Give a real boost to the continent's digital evolution. Everyone sees the potential there as a massive growth engine.
Right. So, we've got green goals, digital goals, ambitious stuff. But let's talk brass tacks. How does this translate into, actual economic benefits? Sustainable growth, jobs, especially with everything going on globally right now.
Yeah, that's the third one, and you could argue it's the most critical. Sustainable growth and jobs.
Makes sense.
This is about really ramping up sustainable investments, finding innovative ways to finance opportunities, and this is key, boosting economic integration within Africa, especially through the FCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area.
We'll definitely need to talk more about the FCFTA later.
For sure. And this pillar also includes helping African states with policy and regulatory reforms, to make the business environment better. Plus, enhancing skills, research, innovation, especially focusing on women and young people.
Okay, so that covers the economy, but what about stability, security, governance?
That's partnership number 4, peace and governance. The EU wants to adapt and deepen its support for African peace efforts, using more structured cooperation, focusing on tense regions. And it integrates things like good governance, democracy, human rights, rule of law, gender equality.
Mm.
Then the 5th is migration and mobility, trying to find a balanced, coherent approach there. And finally, there's this overarching goal of strengthening the international rules-based order, multilateralism, with the UN at its core, really reinforcing Africa's role as a global player.
That is a lot. It's a very broad vision. What's driving this, though, this renewed EU focus on Africa right now? What are the underlying reasons?
Well, a big part is clearly Africa's economic expansion, its potential for social and human development. That's undeniable.
Right.
But a key insight is this explicit recognition of young people and African women as the main drivers for sustainable growth and peace. That's quite specific. And what's also interesting is the EU saying it welcomes other global players showing interest in Africa. They frame it as an opportunity for synergy, not just, a fight for influence.
It's definitely a bold vision. But, the big question always comes back to this. How is all this ambition actually going to be funded? And how will it be implemented? Because, as we'll probably see, the answer might reveal a bit of a paradox.
Indeed. The ambition is huge. They want to make the 2018 Africa-Europe Alliance for Sustainable Investment and Jobs the main pillar of economic relations.
Okay.
That's a massive undertaking.
And if you look at specific areas like digital transformation, yes, Africa's digital economy is growing fast, but it faces real hurdles.
Absolutely.
Things like needing specific skills, challenges with just getting reliable electricity or broadband. Access to capital for African entrepreneurs is a big one, and the need for significant public investment. is not just high-level stuff, it's practical things. Like, apparently the lack of formal address systems in many cities hinders e-commerce.
Mm,
Really basic stuff.
that's a critical point. And
Yeah.
then you layer on the immediate context, like the COVID-19 crisis. That's hitting Europe and Africa hard, but in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely revealing different needs, creating new priorities,
Mm-hmm.
things like health infrastructure, obviously, but also building regional value chains, diversifying economies, industrialization, and interestingly, paying more attention to the services sector, which, as you said, often gets less capital, but creates a ton of jobs.
Right.
And it's also worth noting some topics that used to be high on the agenda, like tackling illicit financial flows out of Africa.
Right.
They seem to be, well, missing from these latest proposals, which is
Right.
curious.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the grand vision, the big plan. Now let's zoom in on the economic reality on the ground. The EU, as you said, still Africa's biggest trading partner, biggest source of foreign investment. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, other players are catching up fast,
Yes.
challenging that dominance.
Definitely. Let's look at the trade specifics. Using 2018 data, total goods trade between the EU-27 and Africa was around EUR 235 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, that's over 30% of Africa's total trade. Now
Right.
compare that. China was EUR with 125 billion, the USA just EUR 46 billion.
So the EU is still way out in front, Uno-wise.
In terms of volume, yes. And the EU's big four economies, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, they're the biggest traders with Africa, both exporting and importing.
Okay, so a huge partner, but the landscape is shifting. And what's Africa actually sending to Europe? Is it still mostly raw materials?
Yes, that's a really foundational point. In 2018, over 65% of goods imported to the EU from Africa were primary goods.
65%.
Yeah, raw materials, food, drinks, energy. And raw materials alone were almost half, 49% of Africa's exports to the EU.
So despite the talk of partnership.
Exactly. It highlights this, well, fundamental economic imbalance. Africa is still largely a supplier of raw materials to the EU. The new strategy wants to change that, but it's up against some pretty entrenched interests. And this includes critical raw materials the EU needs, fluorspar, helium, rubber, phosphate, tantalum, platinum, stuff like that. There's a clear strategic interest for the EU in keeping those supply lines open.
It sounds like a really complex web of dependencies. And who else is Africa trading with besides the EU? Is China's presence still growing?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at where African exports went in 2018, EU got 34%. Intra-African trade was next at 16%, then China at 11%.
Okay.
On the import side, where Africa buys from, EU was 31%, China 16%, intra-African 13%. So China's share, especially imports, is significant and expected to keep growing. European companies are definitely feeling that competition.
And in the U.S.?
U.S. trade is actually waning, decreasing,
Yeah.
partly because the U.S. is more energy self-sufficient now. But you see India and Russia showing upward trends. Russian exports to Africa have more than doubled in the last decade, though overall it's still small, like 2%.
And then COVID hit. That must have really disrupted these trade flows. What were the immediate impacts?
Oh, a profound shock. Demand plunged for many African exports because
Yeah.
factories shut down in the EU and China.
Right.
Prices for base metals, commodities, they weakened a lot. And lower global demand, lower oil prices, that
Yeah.
really hits oil exporters like Nigeria and Angola hard.
But maybe helps others.
Yeah, ironically, it gives some relief to countries that are net importers of fuel and food, like Malawi or Ethiopia. So it's a mixed bag, but mostly very challenging.
You mentioned inter-African trade being low earlier. Still the case. And has the pandemic maybe shifted that dynamic at all?
You're right. It's still very low, globally speaking, around 14% of total trade, considered the lowest interregional trade in the world. But you do see pockets of dynamism, like the East African Community, around 20%, Southern Africa, SADC, about 19%.
Okay.
But what's genuinely interesting, and maybe a silver lining to the pandemic disruption, is that it's really highlighted the importance of regional African producers stepping in to fill supply chain gaps. It sort of forces the issue, reinforcing the need for stronger intra-African trade. It might just be the push needed for more self-reliance.
That's a fascinating point. Okay, let's switch gears slightly to foreign direct investment, FDI. Before COVID, flows to Africa were rising steadily, right? Even if the overall amount was small globally. Which countries were getting the most investment?
The top 5 attracting investment were Egypt, South Africa, Congo, Morocco, and Ethiopia. Now, if you look at who's investing, the countries holding the largest stock of capital. France is still number 1, followed by the Netherlands, the US, the UK, and then China.
And the UK's role is interesting now, post-Brexit.
Definitely. That UK-Africa summit in January 2020 was significant. The UK is clearly looking to strengthen those ties as it finds its new place in the world.
And what about investment from Africa, within Africa, are African countries investing much in their neighbors?
Absolutely. South Africa is by far the biggest player there, investing across the continent. Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya are also important regional investors.
Okay.
But here's a nuance. If you look not just at the stock, but at the number of projects, jobs created, capital inflows between 2014 and 2018, the U.S. and France lead in the number of projects.
Right.
But China accounts for the biggest share of jobs created, over 137,000, and the largest capital inflows, over $72 billion.
Wow. So more individual projects maybe from the U.S. and France, but China's investments are having a massive impact on jobs and capital.
Precisely. It's a crucial distinction. Scale matters.
And are the sectors getting investment changing? Is it still all about resources, mining, oil? Or is it diversifying?
The extractive sector is still key for attracting capital, yes. But there's a definite significant shift towards industry and services.
Interesting. What kind of services?
Well, things like financial and business services, tourism, these are actually creating more jobs than other sectors. And they account for most of the new projects, particularly anything targeting the consumer sector, driven by, urbanization and rising incomes. It suggests a maturing economy.
So this raises a really important question, especially for you listening. How is the pandemic going to shake up these investment flows? We'll probably see a global drop, right? And Chinese projects are already facing delays.
Very likely, yes. A global downturn will hit FDI everywhere.
But given these deep interests from the EU, from China, will investment bounce back? And where might it focus now? Could the EU play a specific role?
My sense is, yes, it will recover,
Yeah.
driven by those long-term interests. And the focus might shift. Healthcare infrastructure seems an obvious one now.
Makes sense.
And the EU specifically, I think it could make really valuable contributions. Developing local and regional value chains, supporting the green economy, helping SMEs, transferring knowledge, building human capital. These are areas where the EU has strengths and where its values align with Africa's needs, especially in a post-COVID world.
Okay, let's try and navigate the policy side of things now, because it sounds incredibly complex. You mentioned the EU's trade policy has traditionally split Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, leading to this plethora of different trade regimes. It sounds messy.
It really is quite a patchwork. Let's break it down. For North African countries, think Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. The EU has had bilateral free trade agreements, FTAs, since the 90s and 2000s. These basically give duty-free, quota-free access for most goods, though agriculture often has exceptions. And while these countries import more from the EU now, their exports to the EU haven't grown as much.
Yeah.
And then there's Libya, where trade talks are just stalled because of the political situation.
Right. And then there are these more ambitious deals you hear about, the DCFTAs. What are those?
Yes, the deep and comprehensive free trade areas. These aim higher than traditional FTAs. They're about broader liberalization, integrating more deeply with the EU market, covering services, regulations, things like that.
So even deeper ties.
That's the goal. They're being negotiated with Tunisia and Morocco, but they've hit roadblocks. Tunisia talks stalled in 2019 civil society protests, change of government. Morocco talks have been on hold since 2014, partly because of the controversy over Western Sahara.
The Western Sahara issue.
Right. Yeah, the EU included those territories in the proposed DCFTA with Morocco, even though it doesn't formally recognize Moroccan sovereignty there. That led to a legal challenge from the Polisario Front, so it's politically tricky.
Definitely sounds like a minefield. Okay, so that's North Africa. What about Sub-Saharan Africa? How does their trade relationship with the EU work? Used to be non-reciprocal, right?
Exactly. Under the old Lomé Conventions, it was mostly preferential access for African countries to the EU market. But under the Cotonou Agreement, the EU pushed to transition towards a partnership model based on reciprocal market access.
And that led to the EPAs, Economic Partnership Agreements.
Correct. The EPAs are essentially free trade agreements, framed with a pro-development angle. But in practice, a key outcome is giving European companies preferential access to African markets.
So reciprocal opening of markets, but these EPAs, they've been really controversial, haven't they?
Hugely controversial, and they haven't been widely adopted. Only about 10 individual countries and one regional group, SADC, have fully applied them.
Why so much pushback?
Several reasons. Concerns about African governments losing crucial revenue from cutting tariffs. Worries about local producers being unable to compete with European companies flooding their markets. Fears that EPAs could actually undermine Africa's own regional integration efforts. And just a general feeling among critics that EPAs are designed more to benefit the EU than Africa.
Right, that makes sense. So, for the many sub-Saharan countries that haven't signed an EPA, how do they trade with the EU? Are there other options?
Yes, absolutely. There are basically three other main setups, depending on the country's status. First, for the least developed countries, LDCs, there's the Everything But Arms, EBA initiative.
Everything but arms, okay.
This gives them 100% duty-free, quota-free access for all their exports to the EU, except weapons, obviously. And crucially, it's non-reciprocal. They don't have to open their markets in return. It's highly preferential treatment.
That sounds like a significant advantage for the poorest countries. What about others?
For other developing countries that aren't LDCs and haven't signed an EPA, there's the Generalized Scheme of Preferences, GSP. This grants some preferential tariffs, but it's the least generous of the schemes the EU applies in Africa.
Okay.
And then there's a middle tier, GSP Plus, for countries considered vulnerable but not LDCs. Cabo Verde is an example. Countries like Nigeria and Congo-Brazzaville fall under the standard GSP. So you can really see why it's called a plethora. It's this complex web of different rules for different countries and regions.
Wow, yeah, 5 different regimes just for Africa. So, what does all this fragmentation mean for Africa's own big integration project? The landmark African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, that seems like it aims for the exact opposite unification.
The AfCFTA is potentially revolutionary. Signed back in March 2018, came into force May 2019. Almost every African country has signed, except Eritrea, and a good number have ratified.
And Ghana's hosting the Secretariat.
Yes. Ghana hosts the Secretariat. Wamkeo Mane is the Secretary General. It's a flagship project of the African Union's Agenda 2063. The whole goal is to seriously boost intra-African trade and use trade as an engine for growth and development across the continent.
And practically, what does it do? When does it start?
Trading was supposed to start July 2020, but the pandemic likely pushed it to January 2021. Once it's running, the core idea is to remove tariffs on 90% of goods traded within Africa. Free access for most goods and services.
90% is huge.
It is. Another 7% of sensitive products will be liberalized over 5 to 10 years, though there's a small group of countries asking for even longer, like 15 years. But still, it's a massive step towards creating a single African market.
So how does the EU officially view this massive African project? They say they support it, right?
Officially, yes. Full support. The 2018 Africa-Europe Alliance communication confirmed full support, pledged EUR 50 million, technical help. It even talked about a long-term goal of a continent-to-continent free trade agreement between the EU and Africa, using the existing EPAs and FTAs as building blocks.
Building blocks.
And the more recent 2020 strategy communication reiterates that. It welcomes the AfCFTA, reaffirms support, and again frames the EPAs and other EU deals as tools to help achieve this continent-to-continent goal.
Okay, but here's the fascinating part. You hear contrasting views, don't you, from prominent African figures?
Absolutely. While the EU says building blocks, people like Carlos Lopes, the AU's high representative with the EU, have argued the opposite. He said EPAs actually fragment Africa, that having all these separate trade deals with third parties like the EU makes it harder to build regional value chains within Africa and boost intra-African trade.
That is a fundamental contradiction, isn't it? How can the EU say it fully supports a unified AfCFTA while critics argue its own trade policies, the EPA specifically, actually work against that unification? It raises that really important question, can this approach of using diverse trade regimes, especially EPAs, truly support Pan-African integration as effectively as maybe a single unified EU-Africa trade regime would?
That's precisely the core tension in this policy landscape. Are the existing EU tools actually compatible with Africa's continental ambitions, or do they inadvertently hinder them? The jury is still out, but the concerns are real.
And just quickly, on the investment side, you mentioned there isn't one single EU framework, but a few main initiatives trying to mobilize funds.
Right. There's the Africa-Europe Alliance itself, aiming to leverage investment. Then the External Investment Plan, or EIP, which uses public money to de-risk private investments, offering guarantees, technical help, dialogues, and then various tools linked to the European Investment Bank, like the ACP investment facility. So different mechanisms trying to bridge that funding gap we keep coming back to.
Okay, so we've covered the vision, the economic realities, the complex policies. Bringing it all together, what does this mean for the road ahead? How is this strategy likely to unfold?
Well, looking at the EU's renewed focus, you can interpret it in two ways, as our sources suggest. Is it mainly a reaction to China's growing influence? A competition thing? Or does it stem more from the EU's own desire to be a bigger global player? Either way, Africa has clearly become this crucial stage for geopolitical competition and, let's be frank, a key source for those critical raw materials the EU needs. The stakes are definitely high.
And we have to talk about that funding gap again, despite all the talk about investment being central to the strategy.
Yes, the communication itself, the strategy document, doesn't actually commit any new money from the EU budget. Apart from specific COVID-19 packages, the prospects for significantly more funding for Africa in the next big EU budget cycle, 2021-2027, look pretty slim.
So there's a mismatch between the strategic importance they give Africa and the actual financial commitment.
Exactly. That's the funding paradox, a gap between the rhetoric and the resources.
And it circles back to the trade regime issue, too.
It does. The EU might be the most open market for African exporters overall, but it's still using 5 different trade regimes. And despite saying it supports the FCFTA, these regimes do divide the continent. They pose a challenge to Africa's own integration goals. That's why you hear strong calls for a single, unified trade regime, negotiated between the EU and the African Union as a whole. That would be a real signal of support for Pan-African integration.
And beyond policy structures, what about the process? The EU's been criticized before for designing things without enough African input. How vital is genuine partnership in the making of this strategy?
Absolutely crucial. If this is really going to be a partnership with Africa, then African actors, governments, regional bodies, civil society, think tanks need to be deeply involved in shaping it before it's finalized, not just consulted afterwards. It needs to be co-created.
Yeah.
There's also a need for more institutional clarity. How will these 5 partnerships actually work? Who does what? The roles of the African Union, the regional economic communities. They need to be clearer, probably bigger, in the final strategy. Some are even suggesting a joint EU-AU investment platform. That would be a real step towards shared governance.
And thinking about those specific pillars like digital transformation, you mentioned the opportunities, but also the risks.
Right. It's a double-edged sword. Huge potential for growth and jobs, yes. But it could also worsen inequality if large parts of the population lack access. And worryingly, technology can become a tool for control under undemocratic regimes.
So the partnership needs to address that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The EU and Africa need to work together on legal frameworks to ensure digital access is fair and that technology serves people, preventing misuse.
And briefly, the EU's Green Deal, that could have ripple effects in Africa, too.
Potentially big ones. The EU, aiming for climate neutrality by 2050, means they'll likely import less oil and gas from Africa over time. That hits key exporters. Plus, new EU rules, like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, could effectively put a tax on certain African exports, making them less competitive.
So they need to talk about these impacts.
Ideally, yes. Conducting joint impact assessments with African partners beforehand would strengthen the partnership rather than springing potentially negative consequences on them later.
And finally, just bringing it back to the immediate crisis, COVID-19, it adds this layer of urgency, doesn't it? The relationship needs to deliver tangible results now, not just talk.
Absolutely. Post-COVID relations need to be tailored to this new reality. Tangible action is key. That can mean seriously considering the calls from African leaders for debt relief, which is a massive burden right now. It means practical support to build resilience. The pandemic is a real stress test for this new partnership rhetoric.
So we've journeyed through this ambitious new strategy, the complex economic ties, the tangled policies. It's clear the EU-Africa relationship is dynamic, constantly shifting.
Yeah, and what this deep dive really shows is that the success of this whole partnership with Africa idea really hangs on bridging these practical gaps.
Yeah.
You've got the funding paradox, big ambitions, limited new money, the fragmented trade regimes versus Africa's push for unity, and the crucial need to ensure African voices aren't just listened to, but are actually embedded in designing the future. So the question for you listening is, what stands out to you in all this? How do you see this evolving dynamic reshaping things in the years ahead?
It's definitely a relationship with profound implications for both continents and globally. We hope this deep dive has given you a good head start in understanding its many nuances.